Think back to the early 2000s. The housing market was seemingly unstoppable. Neighborhoods were expanding rapidly, home prices were soaring, and there was a pervasive feeling of absolute economic invincibility. This era was dubbed the Great Moderation. For nearly 2 decades, the United States experienced low inflation and stable, predictable growth. A dangerous consensus began to form among policymakers and investors. They believed the old boom and bust cycles were a thing of the past. But long periods of stability actually create a hidden trap. When markets are calm and predictable, interest rates usually stay low. To generate the massive profits they're used to, financial institutions are forced to take much bigger swings. Calmness breeds risk-taking. The engine driving this collapse was moral hazard. This occurs when someone is willing to take massive, reckless risks because they know someone else will ultimately pay the price if things go wrong. To see how that hazard was weaponized, we have to look at a financial mechanism called securitization. Securitization is the process of taking various individual debts, like mortgages or credit card loans, and bundling them together into a single financial product that can be bought and sold. Originally, the logic here was entirely benign. If you pool thousands of loans from all over the country, a few defaults won't ruin you. The risk is scattered. You aren't putting all your eggs in one basket. However, the sweeping banking deregulation of the late 1990s combined with a massive appetite for cheap credit, that mixture turned this reasonable safety tool into a dangerous automated pipeline. This securitization food chain functioned as a risk hiding machine. It allowed the people packaging the loans to obscure the underlying danger from the investors buying the products. Let's follow this pipeline from the very beginning, the local mortgage broker. In the 2000s, brokers began issuing a flood of subprime mortgages. These are high-risk loans given to borrowers with poor credit histories, often featuring low initial teaser rates and zero verification of the borrower's income. Historically, a local bank would lend you money and then hold on to your mortgage for 30 years. Because they were stuck with the debt, they cared whether or not you could actually repay it. The new system replaced that with the Originate-to-Distribute model. A broker's only job was to get the borrower to sign the paperwork. They collected a fee for closing the loan and then immediately sold that loan off to Wall Street. This created a total disconnect between effort and outcome. Once that loan is sold, the broker is in the clear. If the borrower defaults 6 months later, it isn't the broker's problem. They've already moved on with their commission. This diagram outlines the housing credit machine in action. You can see the flow starts with easy credit and leads directly down to banks selling the loans off. By design, the foundation of this pipeline incentivized sheer volume over loan quality. Moving up the chain, we reach the Wall Street megabanks. These institutions were purchasing these flawed, high-risk mortgages by the tens of thousands. The banks pooled these loans into legal entities known as special purpose vehicles, or SPVs. An SPV is a separate corporate box created to hold the loans, which officially removes the credit risk from the megabank's own balance sheet. They then transformed this massive pool into a complex product called a Collateralized Debt Obligation, or CDO. They did this by slicing the pool into horizontal layers of risk, called tranches. The top layer gets paid back first and is considered the safest, while the bottom layer absorbs the first wave of defaults. To rapidly finance this endless assembly line of buying and bundling, the banks relied heavily on overnight borrowing, known as the repo market. They were taking out massive short-term loans every single day to fuel the machine. This allowed Wall Street to operate like an assembly line. They manufactured complex products, collected billions in fees, and effectively passed the risk to global investors who had no idea what was actually inside the box. But the banks still faced one final hurdle. They had to convince highly cautious, risk-averse entities like global pension funds to actually buy these newly packaged CDOs. Institutional investors are often bound by strict rules. Legally, many of them are only allowed to purchase assets that carry top-tier safety grades provided by independent credit rating agencies. This introduces a massive conflict of interest. The rating agencies handing out the grades were not being paid by the investors relying on their safety checks. They were being paid directly by the Wall Street banks issuing the CDOs. If a rating agency gave a toxic subprime tranche a poor grade, the bank would simply take their multi-million-dollar fee to a competitor. To keep their market share, Agencies stamped toxic debt with the gold standard AAA rating. With that AAA stamp, the pipeline was finished. High-risk local debt had been systematically converted into a globally trusted investment. Fast forward to 2007. The housing bubble finally bursts. Those initial subprime borrowers holding loans they could never afford begin to default in massive numbers. Because the toxic loans were chopped up and scattered across thousands of CDOs, no one knew exactly which investments were worthless. Pure panic took hold. The short-term overnight funding that Wall Street relied on froze instantly. It was a modern bank run playing out entirely through capital markets. And the real-world impact trickled straight down to Main Street, resulting in millions of home foreclosures. The risk in the system stayed right where it was. Mathematical diversification merely magnified the danger and kept it hidden until it blew up the entire global economy. When the dust settled, the public was introduced to the consequence of decades of deregulation and corporate consolidation, the reality of being too big to fail. This chart shows the growth of U.S. federal government debt. Right here at the financial crisis mark, adding $13.6 trillion, you can see the trajectory permanently shift. Because these mega banks were so intertwined with every facet of the market, the government was forced to step in with a $700 billion bailout. This was the clearest example of moral hazard in action. The massive gains from the boom years stayed in private hands, while the taxpayer was left to settle the multi-billion-dollar bill for the failures. The 2008 crisis serves as a permanent warning. If the people operating these financial machines don't have their own skin in the game, they will continue to gamble with other people's money. When you remove the fear of failure, you guarantee it.